My name is Patrick Anderson. I'm from the Tlingit and Aleut nations. My mother was the Tlingit. Being matrilineal, that's what I claim. I'm Eagle Moiety, Shankokedi, Thunderbird from the Dry Bay Yakutat area. I serve as a trustee and as a senior research fellow in the field of childhood trauma for the Sealaska Heritage Institute. It's my honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Vincent Felitti today. He's a physician who had an idea in the 1980s that led to research that provided great new insights into the suffering of individuals, both health and behavioral. In the 1990s, Vincent was one of two principal investigators for the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, and that's the subject of his lecture today. Personally, I was introduced to the Adverse Childhood Experience Study in 2008 by a colleague, and I appreciate her bringing the subject up with me to this day. As I frequently do with a new topic that strikes me as important at first glance, I buried myself in the literature of ACEs and read it with a digital dictionary by my side because much of the language of ACEs was unfamiliar to me, but not the impacts. The purpose of my quest in learning about ACEs was and remains very personal today, and that is to end the suffering of those that I love, and here's the reason why. On November 8th, 2001, I was sitting in a hospital room in South Seattle, and my second sister had spent the summer in a drug-induced coma because she had dual massive lung infections. She was 44 years old, married to her second husband, had 3 children and a couple of grandchildren. My mother and members of our family sat there as they removed her life support. She had supplemental oxygen in addition to being in the coma, and we watched her die at age 44. She lived 10 years longer than my grandmother did, who died over here of double pneumonia on South Franklin Street. 4 months after my sister passed away, my dad died at the very young age of 67 of a massive heart attack. They were not in each other's lives, but what joined them was the history of trauma that both had experienced in their families of origin. This quest to promote healing from the childhood trauma study has been a very lonely one. It's now 2016, and we still do not have policy within the state of Alaska that addresses it, although there are, as we're discovering today, many fine, wonderful people who are working in the trenches. Tomorrow we speak to the governor to try to convince him that this is a scourge that we need to address. I invited Dr. Felitti to talk to the Chugach people when I was the executive director of Chugachmute. He kindly came and educated us about ACEs, and then he was kind enough to speak to the Council on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault conference the very next day, and the word started to spread. Dr. Felitti confirms that this is a long, lonely journey to educate policymakers about what can be done. And I had another colleague share with me the frustrations of Carl Jung, a great scientist of the mind in the latter part of the 1800s and the early part of the 1900s. And he said that the loneliness he experienced while leading a new movement for healing the mind, in a letter to Sir Herbert Reed, he said, "Your blessed words are the rays of a new sun over a dark, sluggish swamp in which I felt buried. I asked myself time and again why there are no men," he was kind of sexist too, "in our epoch who could see at least what I was wrestling with. I think it not mere vanity and desire for recognition on my part, but a genuine concern for my fellow beings." Our speaker has been on his lonely path for the past 3 decades, but today his research is starting to change policies for addressing childhood-derived trauma all over the world. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Vincent Felitti as he shares his story and research with us.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here in Alaska again. What we'll be talking about today is summarized in a picture, in two pictures that have a question implicitly built into them. I wanted to get it further away so I didn't have all that base.
Okay. Let's see if they can.
If someone gave you this newborn infant with its extraordinary potential and said you had 18 years to develop it into the person lying unconscious on the sidewalk, what would you have to do to accomplish that? It's an ugly question that most people don't like. It's an important question. We know the answers to that question. We simply pretend that we don't. That's really what the ACE study is about. And the answers to that question relate directly and in unexpected ways to major problems in biomedical health, in social functioning, the various addictions, public health, and criminal institutionalization that we all face and pay the bills for in one way or another. The ACE study is what we learned about the origins of these problems and how we came to see that what we commonly perceive as the problem is often somebody's unconsciously determined solution to problems that we know nothing about. That's a big idea that we're going to be coming back to again and again. It reminds me a bit of a house burning down. The most obvious symptom is the smoke. Fortunately, we understand now that that's not the essence of the problem. Otherwise, we'd be bringing big fans to blow the smoke away and treat house fires. The implications of these issues for prevention and treatment are major, and so too has been the resistance to using this information clinically. I'll give you some of the major findings of the ACE study first, and then show you the evidence on which they're based. We found that 10 categories of adverse childhood experience are remarkably common and disturbing, and hence remain mostly unrecognized, that they're powerful predictors of adult social malfunctioning, well-being, health risks, disease, and premature death, and that combination of high prevalence and great destructiveness makes adverse childhood experiences the leading determinant of the health, social well-being, and economy of the country. That's a fairly big, flat-footed statement to make. I have no compunction making it. You'll see why shortly. In a very real way, the study began in 1985 with this patient who turned out to be a major teacher of mine. We had an unusual obesity program. She came in and asked us if we could help her with her problem. Our first mistake was in accepting her diagnosis of what the problem was. I posed the question here, which photo represents the patient's problem? I suspect most of you would assume this. Not the case. You'll see that this was her problem. And this is a really important picture because in understanding obesity, probably the most important initial question is, how old were you when you first began putting on weight? Because whatever you want to assume is the explanation for this obviously had to be before. And this sort of poses the question, my God, what happened between these two? So she came into the program, and we reduced her weight from 408 pounds to 132 pounds, non-surgically. This is much more effective than surgery. And thought, well, my God, we've got this problem solved. This is going to be a world-famous department here. Initially, we thought we knew what we were doing. She taught us we had no idea what we were doing, but merely were in possession of a powerful technology. Keep this in mind. We're going to see it playing out in multiple different ways relating to alcoholism, drug use, smoking, etc. Here's her weight curve. Looks kind of like an Olympic ski jump. 408 to 132. Stays there several weeks. And then in one 3-week period, does something that I had previously assumed was not physiologically possible. She regains 37 pounds in 3 weeks. And I remember asking her, what's going on? And she said, I think I'm sleep eating. What do you mean? Well, when I was a kid, I used to be a sleepwalker, she said. I haven't done that for years. But I live alone, and when I go to bed at night, everything's clean and put away in the kitchen. I wake up in the morning, pots and dishes are dirty, boxes and cans are open. Somebody's obviously been cooking and eating there. I'm the only person there. I'm putting on weight. I guess that's what's happening, but I have no recollection of any of that. Okay. I've never heard of it before, but it has a certain force of logic to it. But why now? Why now? I don't know. But what do you think? I don't know. I understand. But why do you think it's happening now? I don't know. Yeah, you said that already. And on the third pass, she stumbled and said, well, actually, there was this man at work. He was a much older man, you understand. He was married. He said to me, hey, Patty, you're looking pretty good. You lost all that weight. How about you and me making it every week? And that was the day the sleep eating began. And I remember thinking, well, it's a pretty clumsy proposition, but I mean, this is 1986. It is Southern California. It's kind of an extreme response. Why the extreme response? And that ultimately led to a lengthy incest history with her grandfather, who'd been having vaginal intercourse with her from age 10 until age 21. And I remember naively thinking, this is the second incest case I've seen in 23 years of practice. Little did I know. In short order, she was back over 400 pounds, faster than she had lost the weight, and she disappeared for 12 years. She then came back and had bariatric surgery. Her family, a poor family, had collected $20,000 for her to have bariatric surgery. At a point where she had lost 94 pounds, which was not yet clearly visible. I mean, the reduction in volume was not that obvious. She became intractably suicidal, had 5 psychiatric hospitals in the following year, 3 courses of electroshock to gain control of the situation. And here, after all of that settled down, we're talking about why that happened. What she has to say is quite important.
I wasn't really handling the weight loss too well. I mean, it came off too quick, and I just felt like I was losing my protective wall. It was like, you were right, there was no going back. I wasn't able to use food as my way to get fat again, to have my solution back. It's like I had lost my solution, and I was having a hard time trying to find other solutions to deal with the underlying issues of the obesity versus just using the obesity as my wall.
In other words, what everyone else saw as the problem, she saw as the solution to problems that she never discussed, and hence that no one ever knew about. In other words, treating her obesity was removing her solution, not her problem. This is a very important and basic idea that you're going to see repeatedly in a number of different realms. That what we perceive as the problem may indeed be somebody's solution or attempted solution to problems that we know nothing about. About 10 days later, a somewhat similar case came into the program, and that lowered my threshold for childhood sexual abuse, which I had previously naively thought, it occurs, but it's fairly uncommon. We started inquiring of patients routinely on this matter, and in short order was flooded with yes answers. So much so that I had difficulty believing this could be true. I mean, I kept thinking, this can't be. People would know if this were true. Somebody would have told me, wasn't that what medical school was for? 186 patients later, I was pretty convinced that this was real, still had a little bit of residual doubt. And I asked 5 colleagues to interview the next 100 patients coming into the obesity program. They turned up exactly the same thing. So we presented the information on these 286 cases. It was by then clear that this was very real, but nobody wanted to know about it. At a national meeting in Atlanta, I was attacked by the audience. Some guy gets up, and under the guise of asking a question, he makes the pronouncement that I really need to understand that people who are more experienced with this, like obviously this was a national obesity meeting, a very sorry meeting, believe me. The people who know more about these things like they understand that these statements by patients are basically fabrications to provide a cover explanation for failed lives. There was a meeting for speakers that night, and seated next to me was someone from the CDC. And he said, look, if what you're saying is true, it's got enormous importance for the country as well as the practice of medicine. But nobody's going to believe your 286 cases, no matter how well you studied them. What we need is a large epidemiologically sound study involving thousands of people and from a general population, not from some strange subgroup that you've put together somehow. Okay. I have an unusual department back home where 58,000 adults a year come through for comprehensive medical evaluation. How many are we talking about? And we settled, 26,000. Okay, that's good number. That's an adequate number. 6 months' work for the department, roughly. So we then spent the next 2 years reviewing the world's medical literature on child abuse and related issues, and planning how we were going to study this. In 1994, we submitted the protocol for the ACE study to the Institutional Review Board, through which all medical research has to pass. Turned down flat. Otherwise, sensible people said, you can't use that questionnaire. You're going to cause patients to decompensate. You may make occasional people suicidal. As though there were general agreement that inquiring of people's lives was in some way going to be massively destructive. We battled the point for 9 months, finally got agreement. One of us had to carry a cell phone 24 hours a day for 3 years to get supposed phone calls from people that presumably we were going to make jump off the San Diego Bay Bridge. Never got one call. Instead, I have a notebook of letters, largely from elderly women, one of whom memorably summarized the others. She wrote, "Thank you for asking. I feared I would die and no one would ever know what had happened." So here's the structure of the ACE study. The dark blue box in the center is people going through this comprehensive medical evaluation that I mentioned. 26,000 consecutive people coming through that process. We asked if they would help us learn more about how life experiences in childhood might affect adult health. 17,337 agreed to help us. And we have been following them for 20 years now. So we matched current health status here, determined by very detailed medical history, physical examination, multiple laboratory studies, and matched it against what happened back here roughly a half a century ago. The average age was 57, almost exactly half men, half women, 80% white, including Hispanic, 10% black, 10% Asian, 74% had been to college, everybody with high-end medical insurance, etc. Clearly a middle-class population, basically you and me. So we're matching health status here against what happened here roughly half century ago. And then for the past 20 years, we've been following this group forward, matching what happened now against what happened 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago here, matching that to current pharmacy costs, emergency room visits, doctor office visits, hospitalization, diagnoses, and death. So that's the structure of the ACE study. Massive undertaking. The 10 categories of adverse childhood experience that we studied were selected simply because they were the most common that we ran into in the WAIT program. Are they the only 10? My God, no. Might there be others? Without question. But in this clearly middle-class population, these were the 10 most common, and here are their prevalences. Major emotional abuse, basically recurrent humiliation, 11%. An example, well, I met a man a few months ago who told me that when he was a kid, his father used to line them up and tell him, "You kids ought to just be taken outside and shot." Major physical abuse, I don't mean spanking, I'm talking heavy-duty beating with fists, sticks, and other objects, 28%. Contact sexual abuse, not somebody flashing a kid, contact sexual abuse, acknowledged by 28% of the women, 16% of the men, 22% of the group overall. Major emotional abuse, 15%. Major neglect, major physical neglect, 10%. Growing up in a household where one of the members of your household was an alcoholic or a drug user, 27%. Losing a biological parent before the age of 18 for any reason, 23%. And that was interesting because it soon became clear that the least damaging way to lose a parent was by death, unless that death were a suicide. most destructive was maternal abandonment. Mom left when we were 3. We never saw her again. Death at least allowed the creation of a protective mythology. My father would have protected me if, my mother would have cared for me if. Most common was divorce, a subject little discussed. But when one looks at childhood onset obesity, it's striking how often the onset of childhood onset obesity approximates the age of parental divorce. Growing up in a home where someone was chronically depressed, suicidal, mentally ill, or in the state hospital, 17%. In a home where mother was treated violently, 13%. In a home where one of the members of your household was imprisoned during your childhood, 5%. At every turn, we were running into unexpected things. Of course, no one would ever know this information without routinely asking questions that we've all been taught as children that nice people don't ask. And by the way, we found that this is best accomplished initially by an inert mechanism, not face-to-face questioning, by an inert mechanism like a well-devised paper-based questionnaire, quite lengthy, 10 pages long, filled out at home, not on a clipboard in the doctor's waiting room. And then what's on there is picked up and discussed further in the exam room. The 10 categories, interestingly, were essentially co-equal in terms of destructiveness. Again, a surprise. I surely would not have anticipated that. We were dealing with mountains of information, literally over 400,000 pages of medical history questionnaires, physical exam forms, laboratory slips, etc. We needed some way of simplifying things a bit, and so we created a so-called ACE score, where we summed the number of categories, not events, but categories. So if you grew up with 2 alcoholics in the house, that was simply 1 point for the category. If you were molested 32 times by various people, that was simply 1 point for the category. And what we found was that in this population, 33% claimed no experience with any of those 10 categories. 11%, 1 in 9 people, acknowledged experiencing 5 or more of the categories. The ACE score obviously can run from 0 to 10. We found that if any category was present, there was an 87% chance that at least one other category was present, and a 50% chance that at least 3 other categories were present. In other words, you don't grow up in a house where mom was being beaten or your brother's in prison, but everything else was fine. And that women were 50% more likely than men to have an ACE score of 5 or more categories. But what does this look like in everyday medical practice? Well, here's a good example. This very bright guy. In a very real way, an amateur psychopharmacologist, equally a semi-pro saloon fighter. In a different era, this guy might have been a cowboy, kind of person that might be working on an oil rig nowadays or some other isolated kind of work that keeps him away from home. The background history is that when he was 3, his parents divorced. He never saw his father again. At 5, his mother remarried. For whatever reason, his stepfather saw fit to beat him pretty much every day. When he was 8, he tells me he remembers walking to school one day and the thought occurs to him, nobody is ever going to be there for me in my life. When he's 20, he's imprisoned in Rhode Island for attempted murder. He comes home one day and finds his stepfather beating his mother. And impressively, he takes a heavy cast iron frying pan and produces 5 long bone fractures in his stepfather and 1 skull fracture. Ultimately, he gets out of prison, becomes a good citizen, works far from home most of the year. Home is still not a safe place at some level in his mind. Sends his quite significant paycheck home to his 3rd wife, a nurse who believes in him strongly. He's also an alcoholic, a 3-pack-a-day smoker, and a heavy user of street drugs, particularly methamphetamine, crystal meth. Listen to what he has to say about these 3 most common addictions. We usually dismiss them as dysfunctional behavior. Listen to what he has to say about their functionality, because it's a very important idea. Again, illustrating how often what we see as the problem is in fact somebody's unconsciously attempted solution to problems we know nothing about, and how our treatment focuses on attempting to end the use of someone's attempted solution.
20 to 25 years drowning out some poor childhood experiences with drugs, alcohol, cigarettes. Gotten rid of the drugs, got rid of the alcohol. Next thing I got to get rid of is the cigarettes. And I had no idea that the nicotine played such an important part in keeping that door closed.
In keeping the door closed to
The memories that I've blocked out with all these years with the alcohol and the drugs.
so you see what's happening to you now as related to what happened to you decades ago.
Yep. I found a way to block the emotions and the memories.
With
Drugs, alcohol, cigarettes.
Well, it's an interesting point here. He's talking about the functionality of these things, making a pretty obvious point. Indeed, they are helpful in the short term. They are markedly destructive in the long term. But I think most of us have some sense that when things are really bad, give me that pack of smokes now, I'll worry about 20 years from now next week when things are quiet. He's talking about smoking being the most difficult of the addictions to give up. Nicotine has been well known for almost a century to have, within 15 or 20 seconds of inhalation, potent anti-anxiety activity, antidepressant activity, appetite suppressant activity, and as the American Indians figured out centuries ago, anger suppressant activity. After all, it was tobacco leaves that were burned in ceremonial peace pipes, not moss or oak leaves. And these benefits occur within 15 or 20 seconds of inhalation. The risks are very real. They're 15 or 20 years out. But I need help now. Here's an interesting woman who has something to say. This woman was molested extensively by family members and neighbors as a little girl. She compensated for that by smoking 3 packs a day. I just got done explaining about the anti-anxiety, antidepressant, anger suppressant, and appetite suppressant activities of nicotine. The 3 packs a day helped keep her together, kept her slender. At age 35, her husband convinced her that she needed to stop smoking. Bad for her health. She stopped smoking. She was suddenly flooded with male sexual attention, which she had no skill for dealing with, previously having kept that at bay by the cloud of smoke around her. She explained to me rather convincingly, when you're smoking 3 packs a day, this cloud of smoke that's around you keeps people at a certain distance. She started eating to feel better. Her weight got to over 300 pounds. If you need to desexualize yourself, that's a reasonable start. She went into pulmonary failure because the lung damage done by smoking 3 packs a day was tolerated at 130 pounds, but could not be tolerated at 310. So she went onto 24-hour-a-day oxygen. A number of years later, she comes into our obesity program in the very early days, when we still hadn't figured out what we were really doing. And we take her down 150 pounds. And she no longer needs the oxygen. Oh my God, that's really wonderful what we did. She is again threatened by the male sexual attention that she did not know how to handle before. She consciously makes the decision to regain back to 300 pounds and accept the fact that she's going to be on 24-hour-a-day oxygen the rest of her life. Listen to what she has to say about this. It's really quite remarkable. You supplied me recently a lengthy autobiography, a number of dozens of pages altogether. And on the very next to the last line, you said something that I thought was extraordinary. Let me read it to you because I think it's remarkable. I believe smoking 3 packs a day and weighing 300 pounds are not the problem. They're the symptom. Took us a long time to figure that out here, and you just casually drop that as though, of course, anyone knows that. So you are in respiratory failure on 24-hour-a-day oxygen.
Yes.
Major amounts of overweight.
Yes.
And you demonstrated, or we demonstrated together, a couple of years ago that when you had a major weight loss in the OptiFast program here, that your need for oxygen disappeared.
That's correct.
So that if you lost 150 pounds approximately, the need for oxygen would no longer be there. The weight came back. Most people have very little understanding of why people get fat or regain. I mean, they're stuck with this simple belief, don't you know it's bad for you, etc. And people tend to know even less about smoking.
Yes.
It's labeled an addiction, and as though that somehow explains it all.
Right.
Etc. And you make this extraordinary statement about what we perceive as the problem really being the solution. Can you explain more about that?
Yes. I think I've come to that conclusion. It hasn't been quite immediate. It's come to me over the last few years of analyzing just exactly where I've been and what I've done. Obviously, I was a 3-pack-a-day smoker when I was thin. I didn't have a weight problem until after I was 35. But I've done several OptiFast type things, and I finally came to the realization on my own that the reason I put the weight back on was to protect myself.
Right around the same time, we had two men come into the program who were guards at the state prison downtown, and they lost between 100 and 150 pounds apiece. They made no bones about it. They were no longer comfortable walking into the prison. They felt a lot better walking in looking big as a refrigerator. And you think of our expression, throwing your weight around. You know, at some level we understand this. At some level we also keep it hidden. So we looked more into the issue of smoking and matched it against underlying ACE score. Now, many people, of course, hold to the idea, well, the reason people smoke is because when they were kids they passed all those Marlboro billboard ads on the way to school. When we matched current cigarette smoking in San Diego, where it's difficult to smoke. I mean, you can't smoke on a public beach, you can't smoke in a county park, and yet there's been no net decrease in the past 12 years in spite of ever increasing public health pressures against smoking. So in this setting where it's really uncomfortable to smoke, what you see is that there's a distinct relationship to underlying ACE score. As the ACE score goes up, the likelihood of being a smoker later in your life goes up. Okay, well, we've heard several people talk about the short-term benefits of nicotine. Nobody smokes to get lung cancer or bladder cancer or heart disease. People smoke because of the short-term benefits, which are strongly needed and in spite of the long-term risks. So we've been talking about addiction. Addiction is the unconscious, compulsive use of psychoactive materials or agents. In plain speak, it's hard to get enough of something that almost works. Maybe the next mouthful is going to do it. Maybe the next drink, the next cigarette, the next woman, the next man, the next dose of whatever I buy on the street, and if not, surely the one after that. Addiction, traditionally, is thought due to characteristics that are intrinsic in the molecular structure of certain substances. You know, supposedly you take heroin enough times and you're not going to be able to stop. I used to believe that. Everybody believed it. Sounds pretty reasonable. Turns out not to be true, as you'll see in a minute. We found that addiction highly correlates with characteristics that are intrinsic to that individual's childhood experience. Here's what we found in 17,500 people like you and me. Looking at self-acknowledged alcoholism, not someone's diagnosis. Patients we asked, have you ever considered yourself to be an alcoholic? These were people who said yes. You know, it may underrate it a little bit because not every alcoholic is willing to acknowledge that. But the relationship to underlying ACE score is pretty obvious. Sit down, have a drink, relax. Well, some people need a lot of relaxing. We looked at IV drug use. This is really interesting. Self-acknowledged IV drug use. We could not put A-score 6 on the scale here because it is so wildly off the scale that its inclusion makes the rest of this, essentially crushed. At A-score 6, the likelihood of that individual becoming an IV drug user at some later point in life is 4,600% greater than is the likelihood of an of a A-score 0 person becoming an IV drug user. 4,600%. You think you read the latest cancer scare of the week in the newspapers, something increases breast cancer or prostate cancer by 30%, and everyone goes nuts. Here we're talking 4,600% increase in the likelihood of becoming an IV drug user. And the epidemiologists at the CDC told me those are numbers the magnitude of which they see once in a career. Here's the beginning of an insight. In America, the most common street drug is methamphetamine, crystal meth. Everybody knows, really bad stuff. You can die from it and so on. No one seems to recall, however, that the first successful prescription antidepressant medication introduced for sale in 1940 by Burroughs Wellcome and Company was methamphetamine. And it held that position roughly for the next 18 years. But isn't it dangerous? Well, if you take 30 aspirins instead of 2, it's a lethal dose. You decide to triple your dose of digitalis, you're dead in a week. Dosage is critical to safety in the use of any medication. So does this matter in terms of the way we treat addictions? Do you think we should try to focus on the underlying problem? Why is this being used? Or do we continue providing empty advice that what's being done is bad or unhealthy? Think for a minute. If you tell a neighbor, my kid's on that damn crystal meth because there's a dealer on the next block, you'll likely get some sympathy. If you tell your neighbor that your kid's taking antidepressants that he's buying on the street, you're likely to get the question, really? Why? Not a comfortable question, but a really important one. It has everything to do with the effectiveness of treatment. And you might think about whether this might have anything to do with the huge failure of the so-called drug war. Enormous sums of money have been invested in it. I don't think any sensible person sees that there's been any accomplishment thus far. And to help fix this in your minds, here's a full-page color ad from a 1943 issue of the Journal of the American Medical Association for the highly effective new antidepressant, methamphetamine. But isn't it dangerous? Yes. If you drink the whole bottle at once, yes. You're probably looking at a suicidal dose. If you take 1 teaspoon, which is the correct dose, it's very safe and useful. So let this broaden your thinking about the functionality of addictions and about the need to figure out the core problems that underlie addictions if treatment is going to be meaningful. Let's go back to obesity. This man just lost 158 pounds in the program. But the question is, well, why did he ever gain it? He became obese as a child after his parents divorced, and he was sent to live with his grandparents, which included a violent and alcoholic grandfather, so that his mother could work and earn a living. And he vividly recalls eating for solace, as in our phrase, comfort food. And as he grew obese, he discovered that obesity offered advantages. We know that at some level. You know, again, think of our expression, throwing your weight around. But it's easier to blame McDonald's for why kids get fat, even though McDonald's is merely an intermediary mechanism that's used by some and not to be confused with a basic cause. Listen to what he has to say.
It wasn't that I ate because I was hungry. You know, it was, when I look at it, it was just a place for me to feel safe. As a child, I remember there was a point, I would probably say, all the way from kindergarten to, God, I don't know what grade, but I used to get beat up all the time. All the time. And when I got the weight on, didn't happen.
The useful aspects we never think about. Here's someone you might have known when she was a little girl who was being molested by multiple people, although that was never recognized by her parents. She ate to feel better and then realized that obesity reduced sexual attention. Key point here is that what may be viewed by public health as a problem is often viewed by the patient as a solution to problems that the rest of us know nothing about, which obviously can have a lot to do with why certain problems are so difficult to treat, because we're not really treating the core problem. We're attempting to treat the most obvious symptom of the problem. Kind of like treating the smoke rather than the fire when a house is burning down. Listen to what she has to say.
The interview by spontaneously commenting on the threat she felt when her psychiatrist recommended bariatric surgery to treat her obesity and offered to sign the necessary paperwork to have Kaiser Health Plan pay for the procedure.
Can I get comfortable first? And then he says, no. He says, when drug addicts come, we take them off the drugs first. And he would take me off of my drug. Food was my comfort food. I coped with life with food. And it's really strange tonight. I guess the Prozac's helping, because when I'm taking the Prozac, I will lose a little bit of weight. And I just feel that he was taking away my safety. And so I decided not to even bring the paper to the doctor and have it done, because I'm not ready, I don't think, to get the weight off and know that I can't gain it back. I can't be safe again.
Here's the sister of the original patient. She too is over 400 pounds. It would be the easiest mistake to make to say, well, my God, you have two women in the same family over 400 pounds. Runs in the family, must be genetic. But the interesting thing is that in that family, everybody spoke English. That is to say, speaking English ran in the family. We don't jump to the conclusion that therefore speaking English must be genetic.
What's the heaviest you've ever been in your life?
In excess of 400.
So the same as your sister Penny?
Yes.
And how and why did you get so fat?
Well,
I was abused sexually by my uncle. And once again, I used food as a comfort. I didn't have much of a childhood because I started working when I was 13. Then I got married at 17 to get away.
How old were you when your parents got divorced?
I recall I was 9.
Did you ever see your father again?
No.
How do you think being abandoned by him affected you in the rest of your life?
It affected me a lot, especially with the growing up years, because like there was father-daughter dances and dinners, and I'd have to take an uncle, and things like this. Everybody else would talk about their fathers, and mine wasn't around, and it was devastating when my mom and dad broke up. I remember very distinctly.
Moments later, she begins talking about chronic depression. Most people speak of depression as being a disease. Many say it's genetic. Some say it's due to a neurochemical imbalance, and there's something to be said for each of those. But let me challenge that with a different idea. What if depression were not a disease, but a normal response to abnormal life experiences? Here's the evidence for that. Matching self-acknowledged chronic depression against underlying ACE score. You see, as the ACE score goes up, women in red, men in yellow, at ACE score 4 and higher, the likelihood of self-acknowledged chronic depression is bumping 60% in women and 35% in men. We'll look at suicide attempts. This is really striking. Again, as the ACE score goes up, the likelihood of attempting suicide goes up later in life on a massive scale. And once again, ACE score 6 does not fit into the graph. It is so far off the graph. At ACE score 6 and higher, there is between a 3,100 and a 5,000% increase in the likelihood of attempting suicide subsequently, as there is at ACE score 0. We looked at rape, which I once naively thought was fairly uncommon, and what you see is a real distinct relationship between rape and earlier adverse life experiences as a child. You might think about how that works. What are the links? It's an important question because there's more than one answer to what the linking mechanisms are, and you'll see that the implications extend vastly beyond rape. We looked at the making of madness, the presence of hallucinations. And what we saw is that as the ACE score goes up, the likelihood of hallucinatory activity goes up, so that at ACE score 7 and higher, you have a prevalence of 10%. And because we felt that, well, there'd be people who would try to deny the reality of this by saying, yeah, but I mean, at ACE score 7, I mean, my God, people for sure are going to be using street drugs or alcohol to try to feel better. And that's why they're hallucinating. So we corrected for that alcohol and street drugs with the white lines, and you see essentially the same relationship. Of course, nobody'd ever know that without routinely asking. And we've all been taught, my God, you can't ask patients questions like that. I mean, you're crazy. They'll be furious and no one will tell you the truth anyway. Well, to date, we have done it with 440,000 adult patients. And if anybody's been furious, amazingly, I never heard about it, and I expect I would have. So remember, the only way to know this would be by routinely asking everyone. And this is what we found with 17,500 middle-aged Kaiser members, 74% of whom had been to college. We looked at how this plays out with promiscuity, which we arbitrarily defined as 50 or more lifetime sexual partners. Again, you see a rather clear relationship, and it made me think that we might really retitle this Looking for Love. Well, surely the next one's the one who's going to love me, and if not, well, the one after that then. But it's going to happen. And sometimes when relating to one's peers is too threatening, that hope becomes fulfilled with photographs, or by a child, or by a farm animal. We looked at how this plays out in the workplace. I mean, God knows there's lots of toxic workplaces, but not near the number of people who've had toxic experiences working in those workplaces. We looked at absenteeism, saw a distinct relationship to underlying ACE score. We looked at having self-acknowledged serious financial problems, relationship to underlying ACE score. It's an important idea here, because ordinarily poverty is considered to be a cause of other things, and what we're seeing here is poverty as an outcome of more basic issues. Keep in mind the number of people who come as immigrants to this country. I mean, nobody comes here with $10 million in a suitcase. People typically come here poor because they believe there's a greater opportunity here. Many of them do pretty well. Some become very wealthy. So poverty is an outcome rather than an underlying cause. And self-acknowledged serious problems performing my job properly. So anyone running a business really runs into this whether they recognize it or not. How the childhoods of their employees are playing out decades later. We looked at the effect on pregnancy, on unintended pregnancy, and elective abortion. Okay, well, that's not so surprising. That simply shows that unintended pregnancy, which we usually dismiss as an accident, like most accidents, is not totally accidental. What was a surprise here is finding a relationship of ACE score to miscarriage of pregnancy. Well, that's a horse of a different color now. How does that work? How does what happens to a little girl affect the likelihood of miscarrying a pregnancy a couple of decades later? Keep the question in mind. We'll switch now to biomedical outcomes, looking at the relationship of underlying ACE score to later liver disease. And our initial thought is, yeah, well, you shoot up with street drugs, sure, you're going to get chronic hepatitis. You drink enough, you're going to get alcoholic liver damage, and those are true. But it turned out there was more. So keep that question in mind. How does that work? We looked at heart disease, heart attack. Everybody knows since the Framingham study that there are certain recognized risk factors for heart attack: cholesterol, diabetes, smoking, etc. Most people don't know that about 12% of people with heart attacks don't have any of the recognized risk factors. Well, how did they get it? So when we looked at that 12% who didn't have any of the recognized risk factors, we found a clear relationship to underlying ACE factors. Well, how does that work? I mean, we're not talking now about interposing cigarette smoking or something like that. How does that work? Well, in recent years, and this is quite recent information, in recent years it's become clear that under conditions of chronic, major, unrelieved stress, certain parts of our brain are chronically hyperstimulated, causing the release of chemicals that include chemicals causing inflammatory responses. When those inflammatory chemicals get into the very smallest blood vessels, capillaries and arterioles, they cause them to shut down and close, turning to scar tissue, whatever piece of organ they had been supplying before. Our first patient, Patty, died at age 42 of a disease called primary pulmonary fibrosis, a condition where her lungs turned into scar tissue. Never a smoker, no history of exposure to air pollution. Again, in recent years, it's been discovered that a certain portion, yet to be determined, of cases of primary pulmonary fibrosis are due to the release of these pro-inflammatory chemicals. In larger blood vessels, those same inflammatory chemicals cause inflammatory changes in the lining of the big blood vessels, causing cholesterol to precipitate out in those areas, acting like a magnet for cholesterol, which then obstructs the blood vessel, causing heart disease. Oh, isn't that interesting? It's true that high cholesterol is bad, but inflammatory changes attracting high cholesterol make it vastly worse. You all know probably about a class of medicine called statins that reduce the risk of heart disease by lowering cholesterol. We've known that for years, and they work. But in recent years, it's become clear that although that's true, that's not the main way by which they work. The main effect of statins is not lowering cholesterol. They do that, but that's not the main effect. The main effect is an anti-inflammatory effect. Isn't that interesting? How we're progressing in what we know about these subtle things. So one way or another, chronic major unrelieved stress causes major damage decades later, frequently by involving circulatory system and obstructing it. Well, there's always been a great deal of interest in resilience. You know, it's an important concept. But keep in mind that resilience is a way of avoiding thinking about ugly things. Well, I mean, you know, the kid's only 2, he's not going to remember any of this. Kids are resilient, he'll get over it. One of the major researchers in the country, a woman named Emmy Werner, on the bottom of page 67 in her book, makes this important statement: we had not anticipated the high proportion of stress-related health problems that the resilient men and women had. Oh, isn't that interesting? Usually when we're looking at resilience, we're looking, well, how's somebody doing economically, how are they doing socially, how are they doing in their occupation, etc. And she's pointing out that that's only looking at half of the equation. The other half is how they're doing biomedically. I'll give you an example of that. Here's a very interesting example. This is a woman who's quite articulate, nicely dressed. She holds a significant position in a major university. You know, she's obviously doing well. Just the kind of person from whom we'd not seek an abusive childhood history. I mean, my God, you don't need to bother this woman. She's doing fine. Of course, we'd skip obtaining such a history for our own comfort, but we'd be smart enough to say that we don't want to hurt the patient's feelings. So listen to what she has to say. 30 years ago, I'd have dismissed this as craziness. We now understand how what she believes works.
Can you tell just by looking at me that I was an abused child? Can you tell that I was sexually abused routinely, that I was neglected, starved, beaten? Probably not. You would have to ask in order to find out, and that's not the sort of thing that people typically ask about. The downside of having this kind of childhood is that it translates into health problems in adulthood. At least in my situation it seems to have done. I'm now recovering from my third battle with cancer. Not the same cancer, 3 different kinds of cancer. I've had chronic pelvic pain, migraines, the whole laundry list of medical complaints, all of those sorts of things that are very difficult for physicians to figure out. Growing up that way instills a constant fear, a constant state of turmoil that's just under the surface of a veneer that's fairly thin. Little things become scary in an atmosphere like that, and once you've internalized all of that, it's very difficult to let go of it.
She's had 3 different kinds of cancer. That is exceedingly rare. Not 3 relapses of cancer, 3 different kinds of cancer. And one of them was not lung cancer from heavy smoking because she was never a smoker. She also has chronic pelvic pain, chronic migraine headaches, chronic back pain, etc. She relates all of these to her heavy-duty childhood abuse. How could that be? I mean, she's saying, child abuse causes cancer? Come on, that sounds crazy. Actually, we know the pieces that provide the explanation for that. We've just not put them together. We all know that if a person gets an organ transplant, kidney transplant, say, they need to be on lifetime immunosuppression so they don't reject that organ. Okay, makes sense. Some of us will have heard correctly that one of the side effects of lifetime immunosuppression is an increased risk of cancer out in the future. Okay, if I'm going to die of kidney failure next week, give me the kidney and I'll worry about what happens 15 years from now when I get there. The reason that happens, the reason that side effect of increased risk of malignancy from immunosuppression occurs is because we're all forming cancer cells every day in small numbers. And our immune systems process them out and destroy them, and we never know the difference. Getting cancer, therefore, means either that the production of malignant cells is massively increased beyond the ability of our immune system to process them out, or our immune system is suppressed for whatever reason, so that it can't handle even the normal, very low level of production of malignant cells every day. So the question then becomes, well, does it matter whether that immunosuppression occurs as a result of some pills you take every day out of a prescription bottle, or is the result of chronic major hyperstimulation of certain parts of your brain that end up suppressing immune function and often releasing the pro-inflammatory chemicals that we were talking about before. And that's a very real thing. I recently saw the most extreme case of this a woman who was a retired United States federal judge. I mean, that's a big deal. She had one of the worst childhood histories I've run into, molested extensively by her father, who also used to bring her into saloons and sell her for sex to strangers. If you want to read her autobiography, it's on Amazon. It's titled Judging Me. Her name is Bullock, B-U-L-L-O-C-K. It's an extraordinary story. She has 4 different kinds of cancer. In 50 years, I have never seen a patient before with 4 different kinds of cancer. In addition, she has multiple sclerosis. In addition, she has lupus. Those 2 inflammatory diseases are of major significance. We found in the ACE study, when we looked at the whole category of inflammatory diseases, that includes things like rheumatoid arthritis, etc., that there's a very clear relationship to adverse childhood experiences and chronic major unrelieved stress. Probably not the only thing involved in their creation, but a major factor. So this is really a big deal, the conversion of life experience in childhood into biomedical disease, a half century later. So we saw that adverse childhood experiences determine the likelihood of the 10 most common causes of death in the United States. And the risk factors for the 10 most common causes of death are the very things we've been talking about up to now. With an ACE score of 4 or more, the majority of adults have multiple risk factors for these diseases, or the diseases themselves, or have died already. I think I told you, but I'm not sure, that we studied the relationship of ACE score to life expectancy, and we found that at ACE score 6, there is almost a 20-year shortening of life expectancy, 19.7 years precisely. We saw that many chronic diseases of adults are determined in childhood, not by what were once common childhood diseases. I mean, you don't see rheumatic fever anymore. You don't see that the house next door is quarantined because of diphtheria anymore. You don't see people with rickets. You don't see people who have the severe vitamin deficiency disease, pellagra. Those have been replaced by adverse childhood experiences. Adverse childhood experiences always were present. It's just that there were other diseases that had a very heavy presence. So how does this happen? How do life experiences in childhood turn into biomedical disease later in life? Well, there are 3 categories of mechanism. 1, by various coping devices like food, alcohol, street drugs, promiscuity, etc., and the long-term effects of those things that are helpful in the short term. That's one category. Second category is by complex biological mechanisms involving inflammation and the immune system. And this is all very new awareness, really recent years. There's a third category involving epigenetic mechanisms. When we planned the ACE study in the early 1990s, epigenetics barely existed as a word. The field has grown explosively. Undoubtedly, that also plays a big part as a third category of mechanism. We did not study it for the reason, that when we started the ACE study, no one was really giving serious thought to epigenetics. The field has grown extraordinarily. Epigenetics, to be distinguished from mutation. Mutation is structural damage to a gene so that it no longer works. It would be kind of like, turning the lights off in this room by tearing the electric wires out of the wall. Epigenetics would be like turning the light switch to turn them on or turn them off. Epigenetics involves the addition of a tiny chemical to a part of a gene that turns off the function of that gene. It's a big field. You're going to hear a lot about it in upcoming years. It has particular issue in regions where there are large native populations with histories of historical abuse, because it has the potential to be transmitted genetically to subsequent generations. So things like alcoholism, etc., may well have their origins, in what happened when you were a little kid, but they may also have their origins in what happened to your mother before you were even conceived. So 3 big categories: various coping devices, street drugs, tobacco, etc. That's kind of a no-brainer. By complex biological mechanisms involving inflammation and the immune system, and by epigenetics we did not touch, but which you're going to be hearing more about in upcoming years. So what does one do with this information? Well, you can try to help people after the fact. It is difficult, but can be done. It's an act of extreme kindness. You can certainly learn a lot from doing it. But the fact is, the magnitude of the problem is so huge that we'll never be able to deal with it other than by nibbling at the edges that way. If anything is going to be done, it's going to have to be done in terms of primary prevention, figuring out how to prevent these things from happening in the first place rather than fixing them after the fact. No one knows how to do that, but it's the right problem to focus on. So keep in mind the concept of primary prevention. Because if we're ever going to do anything meaningful on a population basis, it's going to have to be through that. Primary prevention is kind of like polio vaccine, as opposed to buying iron lungs to put kids into, to treat them after the fact. An important idea. We saw that there's a public health paradox in all of this, that many of our most common and intractable public health problems are indeed public health problems in the sense that they're socially costly, annoying to other people, etc. But perhaps more important, they're unconsciously attempted solutions on the part of the individual involved to personal problems that often date back to childhood, but that are lost in time and then further concealed by shame and by secrecy and by social taboos against exploring certain realms of human experience. We've all been taught very effectively as little children that nice people don't talk about certain things, and my God, certainly don't ask about them. Ultimately, it became clear that adverse childhood experiences are the main cause of so-called health risk behaviors, of disease, disability, premature death, and healthcare costs. I told you about ACE-score 6 being associated with almost a 20-year shortening of life expectancy. But, I mean, why are these things so monstrously difficult to deal with? Why are they so long-lasting? Why don't people, just get over it? That was a long time ago. Get a life. Here's an answer to that. These are PET scans. A PET scan is a very sophisticated kind of X-ray that depicts in color biochemical activity. So these are PET scans of the brains of 2 3-year-old little boys. On the left, ordinary American kid. This is taken as the normal control. This one, 3-year-old little Romanian boy, kid taken from a Romanian orphanage, institutions known for the extraordinary levels of neglect imposed on the inmates. And what you see is large areas of brain, basically where there's no color, where there's no biochemical activity going on. And I don't think it's going to tax anyone's imagination too much to think that maybe at age 3, when brain is being built, what we're looking at here, the lack of biochemical activity, is going to affect the kind of brain that's being built. In other words, what we're looking at is the conversion of life experience into neuroanatomy, and maybe that has something to do with why these things are so persistent and so difficult to deal with. I'll summarize what we've said thus far with this triangle. At its base, a very large number of individuals with adverse childhood experiences, most of which are unrecognized. We realize now that these produce disruptions in brain development, such as I showed you in that PET scan. We realize now that disruptions in brain development produce various kinds of impairment. Maybe this is the socially isolated kid, the weepy kid, the kid who has trouble learning in school. By the time they become teenagers and have enough freedom to try to do something to feel better, well, eating helps, sex helps, buying antidepressants on the street helps, etc. Nicotine helps. But those things that help in the short term produce major problems, and by middle age, people have a number of diseases, disabilities, social problems. A number die early. The whole sequence is lost in time and further protected by shame and by secrecy. If you ask, well, what can be done to try to make this better? Well, one, understanding that these problems are common and serious. 2, recognizing them in medical practice. And 3, primary prevention. Here's where this all took place, on the top floor of this building in San Diego. Around the year 2000, when it was obvious that what we were learning was of tremendous importance, and while everybody wanted to hear about it intellectually, everybody had explanations why they couldn't get involved in doing anything about it. If I wanted to be a damn shrink, I'd have been a shrink. I'm a pediatric endocrinologist. Or, there's no time. I mean, my God, that's opening Pandora's box. I don't have 2 hours for that. Well, neither did we. Insurance doesn't cover it. You can't ask patients questions like that. I mean, you're crazy. They'll be furious and nobody will tell you the truth anyway, etc. Those are all more palatable explanations for, well, I'm kind of uncomfortable asking patients like that because, I was taught as a little kid that you don't talk about stuff like that. I don't know how to do it. What would you do? So I decided that we would add these trauma-oriented questions to our general medical questionnaire, which 58,000 people a year were filling out at home. We did that. Turned out to have a prominent effect. Properly done, there's no patient resistance. I mean, nobody was complaining about this. The number of yes answers was unbelievably high. And we added some questions that were not in the ACE study, but related. Have you ever lived in a war zone? Ever been a combat soldier? Who in your family has committed suicide, been murdered? Ever held prisoner? Ever been tortured? Etc. We were doing this and having no problems with it for a couple of years, and German mathematician from the University of California comes by, and he has a new startup data mining company that's now on the New York Stock Exchange, and perhaps hoping to use me as a customer to get Kaiser Permanente, using me as a hook to get Kaiser Permanente as a customer. He offers to do as a gift a 130,000 patient study, basically 2 years throughput through the department, to see whether, you know, this change in the questionnaire has any demonstrable effect. To my amazement and pleasure, he demonstrates that the addition of these trauma-oriented questions to the lengthy medical questionnaire that patients routinely had to fill out at home, is associated with a 35% reduction in doctor office visits in the subsequent year and an 11% reduction in emergency room visits. The control group, in other words, doing exactly the same thing, but without the trauma-oriented questions, same history, same physical exam, same laboratory studies, but without the trauma-oriented questions, led to an 11% reduction in doctor office visits in the subsequent year. Here, 35% reduction in a 130,000 patient sample. There ain't many of them around. Well, the outpatient budget for Kaiser Permanente just in Southern California, Los Angeles and San Diego, where we have 3.5 million members all told, the outpatient budget is $6.5 billion a year. 35% of $6.5 billion is pretty serious money. Not enough to translate this into action. Incredible. The change is resisted. Change is a big threat. Someone wrote a number of years ago a small monograph titled The Ordeal of Change. Made the memorable statement about the reason that change is so difficult is that significant change induces a crisis in self-esteem. Oh my God, you mean I've been doing it wrong all these years? But a 35% reduction in doctor office visits in the subsequent year. That might be of interest to people running the state budget or the legislature. It has been in a few other states. Several years ago, I was invited to present this to the Vermont state legislature, and my understanding is that they passed some laws that were designed to stimulate the collection of this type of information routinely in primary care medical practice. How realistic that is, I have no idea. But 5 states, most recently California, have done this. How that will play out over time, time will tell. Practice implications of the ACE study? Well, we showed that a biopsychosocial and trauma-oriented approach to comprehensive medical evaluation is feasible, affordable, and acceptable to patients. That it's possible to move from our current symptom-reactive mode of practice and start dealing with basic causes, and also to markedly reduce the cost of medical care. And that a trauma-oriented comprehensive medical history is proposed as the routine entry mechanism into all ongoing care, whether it be medical, psychological, or institutional, such as in the state prison systems. So I ask you to imagine the possibilities if this were done in Alaska. If you want more information, well, let me summarize this way. I've shown you that adverse childhood experiences are common, unrecognized, and do not typically occur singly. You find one, there's likely to be others. Their link to major problems later in life is strong and makes sense. I mean, my God, you hear the patients explaining this. That we find it comforting to mistake intermediary mechanisms for basic cause. The reason those kids are fat is because that damn McDonald's is doing it. That's an intermediary mechanism, not the reason why. That what we perceive as the problem may be somebody's attempted solution. And I think we have some sense that attempting to make somebody's solution disappear is not likely to be highly successful. And that proper understanding and use of this information provides us an extraordinary opportunity. If you want some further information on it, here are some sources. The top one I would urge you to look at least once, a website, acesconnection.com. I think it's just a marvelously well done job, and many of you, I think, will find it very, very helpful, but other sources of information as well. My understanding is we have some time for you to talk now. Any questions? Yes? Louder? Bellow. Indeed, indeed. Okay, I'm having difficulty hearing you, but my understanding is you're asking, I've mentioned a lot about secondary prevention because what little we know how to do involves secondary prevention, dealing with these issues after the fact. Now, the problem with that is it's very difficult, very time-consuming, very expensive. So it's not going to be available to anywhere near the entire population need. Two things to keep in mind, however. Two forms of treatment that are very effective, and the interesting thing about them is that they are often effective with very small amounts of treatment, like 1, 2, 3 sessions, and hence are affordable to people who never could afford, chronic ongoing treatment. And the first of those is medical hypnosis. And if you want to read about that, go to the website for the American Society of Clinical Hypnosis, American Society of Clinical Hypnosis. You can read about it. You can find competent practitioners locally, etc. The other form of treatment, which has the advantage of often being effective, and when effective in very small amounts of treatment, hence affordable, is EMDR. Okay, again, look up EMDR on the website and on the internet, and you can read about it. I certainly am a believer in conventional psychotherapy. On the other hand, I don't have many patients who tell me, well, doctor, it's okay, I put aside $40,000 for psychotherapy. Okay, so the advantage of medical hypnosis and of EMDR is that they often provide significant relief and at a cost that's affordable for far more people than otherwise would be the case.
I just want to talk to you. My name is Patricia Graham. My complete name is Shuston. I'm originating from Queens. I'm a raising dog salmon. And I grew up with severe abuse. physical, mental, sexual, and spiritual. And drug and alcohol addiction, suicidal ideation, cutting, self-abuse. And I was really messed when I came to Juneau after 4.5 years of crack addiction and severe alcohol addiction after I lost my children to those hands. Excuse me. I am a strong, empowered warrior woman today because I sought help from a specialist for post-traumatic stress disorder and bipolar disorder. And I met Amalia Monreal through my doctor Bruce Weeks from Search. And I had 5 years of intensive therapy with her. Sometimes she saw me twice a week. And she introduced me to a program that's offered at Lincoln Ohio Central Council. And it is a program that comes in 3 phases, and each phase is 3 months long. And I want to tell you, this changed my life completely. And I went from a weak, abused person to who I am today. And the first phase is on stress, anger, and communication. The second phase is personal and family development, which focuses on dysfunction in childhood that is brought into our adult relationships. And the third phase is on overcoming trauma, specifically sexual abuse. I went through the 3 phases 2 times, 2 years, and came back to become a co-facilitator. And I can say that I reach women on a deep level because I have been through what they're going through. And I just wanted to say that there is healing, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Yes.
I would like to moment to thank every one of you for being here. I too have suffered in my childhood, and I'm taking steps to prevent it in my daughter. Each one of us can give counsel to each other. It does not require a PhD or years of study. We each have these problems, and we also possess the solutions for each other. If we just sit down and talk, say hello, become close, take the time to listen to each other, cry with one another, we will find solutions. One by one, child at a time, we can change this. I'm doing everything that I can necessary for my daughter to see that this world is not bad. This world is not evil. It is not full of mishaps, mistakes, and diseases and pestilence. You know, there are good things still in this world. And it is you and you and you and all of you here present today. We are all the solution for our own problems. And I wanted to say thank you all for being here.
Thank you for saying that. What you said is enormously important. People have asked me, 35% reduction. How'd you do that? You sent everyone to therapy, right? No. We essentially sent nobody to therapy. Well, how'd you do that? We spent a lot of time thinking, how did we do that? And came to the realization that asking, initially by an inert mechanism, and then picking up on that in the exam room, I see on the questionnaire that, can you tell me how that's affected you later in your life? And listening and implicitly accepting was a very powerful form of doing. Because the damage of all of this is heavily centered on a profound sense of shame, unworthiness, inconsequential life, etc. To be able to tell somebody and have them listen and accept you as a meaningful human being is a very, very powerful tool. in essence, it's what's done with confession in the Catholic Church. I'm not saying that as a religious person, because I'm not, but confession has been in use for approximately 1,800 years, suggesting maybe it meets some basic human need. And in that very brief process, the essence is that one person tells somebody who's important to them, a priest in that case, in our case, a doctor or a nurse practitioner, something deeply shameful about themselves, and realizes within a couple of minutes that they still seem to be accepted as a meaningful human being by this individual. A very powerful tool, asking and listening and implicitly accepting. I thank you for bringing that out. You're absolutely right.
I've been in the mental health system for about 15 years, and I know I'm very young, so it's kind of impressive. And I just found out that death did not have to be the top of that pyramid, so I made it up to that point. And I wanted to thank you for letting those people do those questionnaires on their own time, because I have been in situations where I'm trying to get admitted into facilities for mental health because I am actively not okay, and I recognize that. And you just get interrogated. There's rounds of questioning, and you don't get that acceptance in between. It's like, has anyone in your family committed suicide? Okay, great. The next question. All right, when did you first contemplate suicide, or stuff like that? So, and at the end of those processes, I had a panic attack and left, so that I didn't even get the help I needed. Anyway, it's reinforcing behavior, and I was wondering if there's a way to mitigate that on a health professional level.
Well, I mean, you're certainly asking the right question, and I don't think anyone has an experience-based answer to that question. But one possibility, I mean, I'm not so much worried about the lack of an answer. The key thing is that it's the right question to focus on, and I think that by focusing on the right question, we greatly increase the possibility of getting a meaningful answer to it. One thing I'm working on now is something called the North American Health Index, which will be a uniquely comprehensive medical history questionnaire, including developmental life experiences, to be placed on the internet, free. That anyone who wishes can fill it out, and if they wish, print it out at home, and if they wish, give that to their doctor. Now, I'm not so naive as to think the doctor is going to be thankful, because they will correctly perceive that the mere possession of this information has imposed an unsought responsibility on them. The experiment is whether, with time, being presented nice laser-printed, highly organized output, some meaningful portion of the recipients will begin to see the relevance of this for everyday medical practice to improve their understanding of what they're dealing with. People have often said to me, oh, isn't it terrible to have to listen to these stories all day long? No, not for me. I found it relieving to finally understand what was going on. What was painful and disturbing was to be responsible for problems that I couldn't figure out. So this was, of real benefit to me as well as to the patients. In other words, if the North American Health Index is successful, it'll probably be another year before it's out. It will be successful because it enables patients to act as a market force to bring about a needed change in primary care medical practice, to move it from being a symptom-reactive process to one that is more comprehensively understanding of underlying causalities. You see, in all of medicine, there are only 3 sources of diagnostic information: patient history, physical examination, and laboratory studies. If you ask patients, and I have literally done this of 10,000 some years ago by questionnaire, overwhelmingly patients assume diagnosis comes out of lab tests. Oh, I want all the blood tests, doctor. You know, I want them all. Yeah, right. Which of the 4,327 do you really mean? If you speak with experienced physicians, they'll tell you that about 80% of the time, diagnosis comes out of patient history. The problem with that is that it is time-consuming. It's easy to forget to include certain pieces, or to, out of one's own discomfort, to leave them out. Time-consuming, hence expensive, fraught with interpersonal difficulties. Well, this doctor's too young to understand, or this one's too old. I'd rather talk with a lady doctor about this. I'd rather talk with somebody who's, Korean, Polish, whatever, like me, that would understand better. It was amazing to see that with a well-devised inert mechanism to gain this information initially, how easy it was to gain it in depth and in detail. Might people have lied and said no? Yeah, I have no doubt. The number of yes answers we got was mind-boggling. And that was what we were able to work with. I see on the questionnaire that. Can you tell me how that's affected you later in your life?
That's the question that was never asked,
Of course.
It's just been recently that they started asking these questions. I remember no one asked why an 8-year-old was trying to kill himself.
Sure.
Until I got into drugs and stuff way later. So I'm glad they're being asked, but it's giving the time to process in between when you're being asked is necessary.
Another useful tool is autobiographical writing. And if you want to read about this, look up the name on Amazon, James Pennebaker, Pennebaker. James Pennebaker is a professor of psychology at the University of Texas, and he has for about the past half-century been studying the use of autobiographical writing in medical settings. And having people write down in detail, their whole lives and what's happened and how it's playing out has been very, very helpful. So I've been asking patients to do that since the late 80s when I first heard about it. Probably 85% of people are agreeable to it, and they'll email it to me in 5-year segments. It enables the transfer of huge amounts of information, very inexpensively. It's easy and quick to read, provides tremendous understanding. Perhaps most importantly, it allows the patient to understand that somebody has heard their worst and ugliest secrets and is still willing to talk with them, etc., that they still have meaning.
What are your feelings about the work of Peter Levine and somatic therapy in the nervous system as it relates to trauma and how our bodies are learning how to trauma response?
Yeah, I think what he's doing is quite impressive and useful. He's a good writer as well. If you are looking for some additional books, a man named Bessel van der Kolk, you know that, okay, The Body, huh? Oh, okay, he wrote a book, this is really interesting. Van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, was on the New York Times bestseller list 10 days after it came out. That's really incredible. This guy's not writing a storybook, he's writing heavy-duty book. I was so impressed and pleased. Another book, Childhood Disrupted, by a woman named Donna Jackson Nakazawa, Nakazawa, a woman with extensive autoimmune disease problems, was seeing an internist at Johns Hopkins who told her about the ACE study, and she started reading about the ACE study and ended up writing 2 books about how life experience translates into disease. She really did a superb job. Another book, Scared Sick, a book, a woman named Robin Carr Morse, in Karr-Morse in Oregon wrote that book. She too did a really terrific job of taking on a difficult technical question and explaining it really very understandably.
My name is Lee. I'm the Central Council, and one of the things that we struggle with, the biggest thing I think that we struggle with, is the ACEs, putting it together with historical trauma that our people have experienced up here since the 1700s, the impacts of other cultures trying to change us so that we have a lot of young people nowadays who don't know who they are or where they come from, and that affects them mentally, because they're treated differently in most situations in this community population because of their age. We have high, disproportionate numbers in child welfare, juvenile justice, adult correction, etc. And I believe it's an impact of this historical trauma. So this is such a huge topic that impacts so many segments of our community. And how do we assist treatment providers and those working with our folks to acknowledge that this individual here is impacted by generations back then, and how can we help this individual here understand it's not his fault?
So you're talking about enormously complex issues, and no one currently has, the clear answer to them, but a useful beginning might be with that huge portion of the population that has had no personal experience with supportive parenting themselves while growing up, and hence who's highly unlikely to be able to provide that to their own children. What if one were to develop a soap opera where woven into the storyline were illustrations of what supportive parenting looks like and how it plays out decades later, contrasting that with illustrations of destructive parenting and how that plays out decades later? I suspect that there would be many people who would see something, yeah, I can do that. And I was talking with Patrick Anderson before about an old-time radio show when I was a kid. My father's a pediatrician, and at the end of the war, there was a radio program called The Doctors Talk It Over, Saturday afternoon, 4 o'clock. Each week they would have 1 or 2 patients would be interviewed on the radio by a physician, and then there would be several other physicians who would talk about how they understand the case, what they would see, might be useful approach to take, etc. It would be, again, an inexpensive experiment. If patients came on anonymously and were talking on the radio with several people who were supportive and understanding of what the possibilities are, it's a beginning. So keep the ideas in mind. You are going to have universities and colleges around that have departments where there are people who are familiar with broadcasting techniques and psychology and so on that might be willing to help develop such an idea to test it out.
One thing I was thinking about how our body, our society, our neurological memory holds on to things. And all the accidents that my siblings and I had experienced in our life, it sort of healed up and forgot, you know. I don't walk around and go, oh, I sliced my finger on a broken window pane in high school, and, you know, I don't hold my hand out like this and look to the scar all the time. It's just, you know, it healed up to it. And we got an N1H1 flu shot about 3 or 4 years ago. And now it's like our body, it made our body remember all those injuries and how they happened and where they happened. And like frostbite when we got off to a whiteout going to school in Ohio. And, you know, just all those things. And there weren't a lot of them weren't malicious intent from someone else. They were just, you know, accidents. And it's like my sister was going like, remember when we got lost in the whiteout? And I go, yeah, my ears are always itchy now. And they get used to, and you know, all these things, all the accidents that I thought built up. It was just like after the flu shot, it was just like it turned something on in my body, and all of a sudden, all these injuries start hurting all at once again. Like if my body had not let go of the memory. So, and my siblings, I have my siblings. We got the flu shots in different states without even telling each other. So,
yeah, I certainly can't explain how the flu shot would have triggered that, but it's a very interesting description that you're giving. And keep in mind also that there are things that happen to us very early in life, long before we have any potential for remembering them, you know, like at 6 months or a year old or a year and a half old, etc., that affect the development of a person's brain and set the limits for triggering depression and anxiety and so forth later in life. What the idea that I tried to put across with the PET scan, I mean, what happened to those kids at age 3 is not going to be remembered, but it will still affect them by imprinting on developing neuroanatomy.
Do you have any suggestions on the epigenetic research that's coming up?
Well, if you're looking for a good beginning book to understand what's known in the field, one I found very useful, a man named Peter Nathaniels, Nathanielsz, wrote, and it's called Life in the Womb, and the subtitle is The Origins of Human Health and Disease. I found it very productive. If you're looking for some big names in the field to, you know, Google their names and see what they've published recently, 2 people I know at McGill University, Michael Meany, M-E-A-N-E-Y, and Moshe Zif, M-O-S-H-E, last name S-Z-Y-F, are major figures in that field. If you're looking for names in neurochemical advances, oh dear, he's at the Rockefeller Institute in New York. I've known him for 15 years. Bruce McEwen, M-C-E-W-E-N. I mean, those are major figures in the world, and you know, would be a good way of starting to get information. But keep in mind the very first place up here, acesconnection.com. I mean, it's a very, very useful website that provides information that changes daily on what's going on around the country, what good sources of information are, etc. The woman who started this website is a newspaper woman who, Jane Stevens is her name, who is writing a book about the ACE study. And she started this blog impressively to get some sense of where focal interest was in the community so she could be sure to cover those areas in the book. She's an enormously skillful writer and a highly knowledgeable person. Might make a very good speaker.
It seems like if cells can mutate because of harm, it could happen the other way.
Probably so. I mean, we're just at the beginning. Yes, absolutely. This guy, Moshe Ziff, is an epigenetic pharmacologist. So there are serious people working, might there be useful chemicals that can improve epigenetic problems?
Thank you for coming. This is really great information, especially to hear it from the horse's mouth. With anything concerning prevention, I think education, communication, and meditating, not necessarily in that order, needs to be taught to children at an early age, and not pushing Buddhism, but the Dalai Lama said, children at the age of 8 should learn to meditate in order to deal with adversity and their own emotions,
Yes.
and sitting with their own thoughts. And that goes a long way. Maybe one day wars will end.
Yeah, no, I think what you're saying is sensible and practical.
I think what it boils down to is the whole idea of incorporating the body, mind, spirit.
Yes.
And not separating it, because when we try to separate any part of it, we lose so much. And in the old culture, that was very important, from what I understand. And if we can, when we see families or individuals who have those three together, it seems that they're a lot healthier and a lot stronger. It gives them hope for whatever is going on.
I think that's true. Yeah. Well, I thank you for inviting me here, and I thank you for attending.